Alright, we are ready to begin our next lesson. In this lesson, our learning goal is that students will be able to use exponents to represent values in expressions. We have already learned that you can use exponential notation to represent larger numbers in expressions. We're going to review some terminology. We've talked about this before, so we're going to go a little bit quicker than we have in the past. The base is the part of the number when we write it in an exponential form that's a factor, which means we're going to multiply it by itself a certain number of times. The next term is exponent, and the exponent is the part of the exponential form that tells us how many times we're going to multiply the factor by itself. So here's an example. This number 4 with an exponent of 3, or that 3 that's written in a superscript form, that represents 4 to the third power. Alright, and the parts that we just talked about, the base is the number 4. That's the factor that we're going to multiply by itself. So we're going to do 4 times 4 a certain number of times. How do we know how many times that is? We're going to look at the exponent to tell us how many times we're going to multiply the 4 by itself. Alright, so in this particular case, 4 to the third power, we would multiply 4 times 4 times 4. Okay, we're going to multiply 4 times itself 3 times. Okay, we can write exponential numbers in 4 different ways, and you need to be able to write it in all 4 ways. The first one is what we just went over, the exponential form. It has a base, which in this case is a 4, and it has an exponent, which in this case is a 3. The second way we can write it is as multiplication, so we can take the exponential form and turn it into a multiplication problem. You'll see that the 4, which is the factor that we multiply by itself, is written 3 times. Notice there's no 3 when we write it as multiplication. We don't write the number that's the exponent when we write it as multiplication. We write the factor the number of times that the exponent tells us to write it, and that's probably the biggest confusion that students have, is they want to do 4 times 3, which is not what the exponential form represents. The third way to write it is in standard form, and simply to find standard form you just solve the multiplication problem. So you do 4 times 4, which is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. And the last way that you can write it is in written form. Like we said before, that number is 4 to the third power. There are 2 special written forms that we are going to talk about. One of them is when we use the word squared. So if we were to say 4 squared, what we would mean is 4 to the second power. Another special way of writing exponents is to use the word cubed. When we use the word cubed, if we had 2 cubed, that would mean 2 to the third power. Alright, so let's do some sample problems. We're going to write our sample problems in the 4 different forms that we have up here for our examples. The first sample problem that we're going to do is 2 to the 5th power. Okay, so we are going to write 2 to the 5th power in the 4 forms. The first form is to write it in exponential form. Well, that's the way the problem is written, so we don't have to do anything extra for that. 2 to the 5th power is exponential form. The second way we can write it is as multiplication, and so we're going to use the 2 as our factor, and we're going to multiply that 5 times. So it's going to be 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And so this is as multiplication. The third way we can write it is as standard form, and when we write it in standard form, we just solve this multiplication problem. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32. This represents 32, and that's standard form. And then the fourth way we can write it is in written form, and that's just simply 2 to the 5th power, and that's written form. All right, so that's the 4 different ways that you can write 2 to the 5th power. Okay, our second sample problem, it's written in the as multiplication form. So it's 8 times 8 times 8, and we're going to take that number and write it in the 4 different ways that we can represent that. Okay, so I've written down the problem. It's as multiplication. That's the form that they've given us, and we need to write it in the 3 other forms. So the first one we can write it as exponential form. We see that we have 8, which is going to be the factor, and we know that we call that the base, so we put the 8 there. And then we see that we have 3 8s, and 3 8s means that we're going to have a 3 as the exponent, and that would be exponential form. The second way we can write it is a standard form, and in standard form we multiply 8 times 8, which is 64, and then we have to multiply 64 times 8. Well, I can't do that in my head, so I'm going to write that over here on the side. 64 times 8. 8 times 4 is 32. 8 times 6 is 48, plus 3 is 51. And so the standard form of that is going to be 512. And then the last way that we're going to write it is we're going to write it in written form, and that would be 8 to the 3rd power, or we could write it as 8 cubed, because cubed is one of those special forms. So when you see it to the 3rd power, you can say cubed. If you see it to the 2nd power, you could write squared. All right, let's go ahead and do our third practice problem, or sample problem. And for this sample problem, we're going to do 7 to the 4th power. All right, so they give us 7 to the 4th power, and that's already in the exponential form, so we don't have to rewrite that in any way. The next thing we'll do is we'll write it as multiplication. So we see that our factor is 7. We're going to multiply it by itself a certain number of times, and the exponent tells us we're going to do it 4 times. So it's going to be 7 times 7 times 7. All right. The next thing is to write in standard form, and in standard form we're just actually going to multiply this out. I know that 7 times 7 is 49. I have another 7 times 7, which is 49. So I'm going to write over here 49 times 49. So 9 times 9 is 81. 9 times 4 is 36. Plus 8 is 44. Put our placeholder 0. 4 times 9, 36. 4 times 4 is 16. Plus the 3 is 19. Then we're going to add these up. And so it's going to be 2,401. 2,401. And that's the standard form. And then the last way we're going to write it is in written form. And so it's going to be 7 to the 4th power. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move to our practice problems. Please go on to Moodle, complete the practice problems that you have there. And then after you've completed that, make sure that you rate yourself, write that up next to the heading on your notes, and bring any questions that you have to class tomorrow. That's it for tonight. Have a great evening.